Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. And today's topic is going to be on jujubes and persimmons. So this year's crop of jujubes is, we sold a lot. We sold them before we canned them up. So at this point, we don't have a lot of plants left. They are one of the new up and coming types of fruits that most Americans are just now discovering. They're an ancient plant from, let's put down the name first, so we call it jujube. Botanically, it's ziziphus. And these come from, now they come from Asia. There's different kinds of jujubes. They're related to plants that are found in America, and they're related to plants found in Europe, but those plants generally do not make fruit, edible fruit, that is. And even the most wild jujubes, original jujubes, the fruit size is smaller than a marble. So more like blueberry-sized fruit, and they're tart. So for most of their history, jujubes were used as more as medicine or herbal use. They had vitamin C, of course, like most fruits, so they helped treat some of those diseases from lack of eating fresh food. Um, but in the last couple hundred years, they've been selected for size. So now jujubes, the biggest ones we have, get up to about chicken egg size. The average size may be a little bigger than a kumquat. So jujubes, and they're very unusual. So jujubes are unique in that one of the few fruiting plants we have that fruit on new growth. So this makes them easy to trim, as long as you don't go below the graft. Now jujubes are expensive because they don't do well with bud grafting. So most fruit trees, even the persimmons, they grow the rootstock from seed, and then they just slice in and insert one growth bud from the mother plant into that rootstock, and then they can grow the tree from that. On jujubes, it's one of the few fruit trees that we have, other than avocado and say citrus, where they actually graft the piece of the branch on here. So on this particular one, I can see they had about a 2-inch piece of branch from a mother plant that they grafted on here, which makes jujubes more expensive for us to get. They're probably, in fact, the most expensive bare root fruit tree we get, especially for their size when they come in. They're rather small. So they fruit on new growth, and that makes pruning them very simple. So in 1 year, jujubes grow maybe 5-6 foot max. These young plants will probably only grow a couple feet. But they will fruit on new growth. So now this year, the weather we're having is very early spring-like still. It's June, but they're still acting like it's April. But I do see some flower buds forming at the bases of the leaves of this branch here. This branch is a little thicker branch. So the flowers are forming. So this thing will try to make fruit this year. Hopefully we'll have some bees out and the sun will come out. The other thing about jujubes that's, especially the older literature, is mistaken in that they're self-fertile. Well, what I would say is they're partially self-fertile. But you only need one tree. So the one thing that's common with jujube trees is they sucker, either from the roots or from this is coming from below the graft. So this is a genetically different tree than this is. And this sucker will also bloom this year. So this sucker will bloom along with these flowers, and it will help pollinate and get more fruit. So we think the original literature thought they were self-fertile only because they sucker so freely that on farms they wouldn't have to plant a different tree as long as they allow a few suckers to grow. Then pollination of this plant will be just fine if you just had one variety or one cultivar in stock. So, so we can tell people, yeah, you can buy just one tree, but allow a sucker, at least one sucker to grow, or get two different varieties. Right now, I don't have too much. Now, in wintertime, in bare root season, we carry quite a few, and we'll list them. But this time of year, we just have a few varieties left. So allow the root sucker to grow. Now, generally, jujubes are quite thorny when they're young. The new growth, when they're young, very thorny. So be careful. What we notice is on older trees, the thorns pretty much disappear. Now, on my own tree, I planted, say, 20 years ago, when my son was quite young. I didn't want him to get in the way of thorns, so I cut all the thorns off the trunk, and they did not grow back. So once you remove the thorns, they don't regrow new thorns on the trunk. And generally, the older trees are totally thornless. They do have an interesting style of growth, which makes them quite attractive. They have a slight zigzagging between the leaves and stems. So the trees zigzag up and then they arch out and zigzag back down. So they do have a very nice look to them, ornamental look. And again, they fruit on new growth. So we had read an article 30 years ago that jujubes in Asia, especially the third world countries, they use the entire tree. So each tree would produce maybe 20 pounds of fruit, say August, September, and 2 weeks after that, the book says they would strip off all the foliage after the fruit was harvested and feed it to their cattle. So they had this for cattle food. And then in the wintertime, they would cut the trees down to a stump, about a 4-foot stump, and use that wood for firewood. And then the tree would grow back the next year and do the same thing again, have 20 pounds of fruit. So I had to try that. I had a 8-foot tall jujube tree in my backyard, and I said, well, I gotta see if this actually works. So I actually cut it down to 18 inches high, and then by the next summer, it was back up 5 foot, flowering and ready to fruit again. So you can cut them really short. So if you wanted a jujube bush in your yard, cut it down to about knee height every winter. Don't go below the graft union, and it will vigorously grow back, flower, and fruit the next year. And if you wanted to have two varieties, you can. I had mine about 2 feet apart, planted in my yard. Now the bad thing about the suckering is the root systems. If you disturb them, they will send up new little trees. Now most of the suckers, I've eaten the fruit on them. They're usually a little more tart. I still eat them, but they can come up all over the garden, which can be a problem. If the more you dig around the roots and damage the roots, wherever you damage them, they tend to send up new trees. So that's somewhat of a minor problem. I mean, trees, it's not as bad as, say, morning glory, where you just can't stop it and they grow fast. They're not real fast growing, so you can kind of control the suckers that way. They do not need a chill requirement. We noticed that on the winters about 10 years ago, when we had no winter, 2013, 14, they woke up at the earliest we've ever seen them wake up. They were blooming in January. It was so hot in January, they were blooming in January. Normally, typically, when we've grown them over the past 40 years, they usually wake up around May. So they like warmer nights, warmer weather. This year was no exception. They woke up in May. They're growing pretty fast now. So they just respond to heat. If it's cold, they go to sleep. are cool. You know, if it's below 50 degrees at night, they go to sleep. So they actually go to sleep rather early. We often see them go to sleep in October or in November when the nights drop below 50 degrees, and then they don't wake up until it's warm again. So that is one of their unfortunate disadvantages. Is they can be in leaves only about half the year. So okay, so the different varieties of jujube. The original ones brought from China, oh, probably 100 years ago, maybe more than that, were Li and Lang. Li we still grow. We think it's one of the best ones. It's a fruit about the size of a chicken egg, and the more mature the tree is, the larger they get. The the hotter the climate, the larger they get also. Lang is a smaller, more slender one. Lang, we had trouble getting it real sweet and ripe here. It doesn't like this weather at all, so we'd rather go with Lee. They Most jujubes have a fairly decent sized seed in the middle, and the rest of it is edible. Um, they do have a nice tender but crispy texture. The flavor is apple, but they're probably about twice as sweet. So the book says about 20% sugar. So really, really sweet. The ones that are chosen to cultivate are very sweet. So we don't grow Lang anymore, but Lee. Now most jujubes ripen, and it depends on the weather, late summer, early fall. A few of them ripen mid-fall, um, and most of them overlap. So you can say typically September into October, and they don't all ripen at once. They do have probably a 5-6 week ripening period. Now the color of the jujubes is kind of a light green, and then they mature to a kind of a um, mahogany. Now we like to eat them when they're almost totally mahogany, a little bit green showing, almost totally mahogany. Sometimes when they're totally brown or mahogany, they're already getting a little mushy. Now some people like to dry jujubes. They do taste like dried apples, but just a bit sweeter than a true apple, dried apple is. Now the newer ones that we carry, um, back in the 90s, one came out called GA866. Chico State was selecting a lot of them from, they grew a lot of seeds and were selecting some. This is GA866. Never got a formal name. The GA866 stands for the row and number in the row that they were on in the test fields. But this at that time was rated close to 30% sugar, and at that time our customers told us that is the sweetest fruit you got out there. These tend to be a little bit longer and narrower. Right now, and I don't have them in stock, Honey Jar is considered even sweeter. However, Honey Jar, we think it's just because the sugar is more concentrated because the fruit's only about this big, like a big marble. So it's a much smaller fruit than the rest. Now there is a new one called Shanxi Li, which is supposed to be the biggest jujube. They said it's bigger than the original Li, but it's interesting. The name is interesting because the original Li comes from the Chinese province of Shanxi. So we're not positive that Shanxi Li is genetically different from Li. It might be the same fruit. And we haven't seen the fruit be any bigger than this one yet. So, and then another one that we have is, and the small one over there is called sugar cane. It is probably sweeter than J866 also. Some of our customers say that's their favorite. It's about the size of a kumquat. And it's got a little bit, the way it looks, it's a little bit more slender growth, a little more zigzag growth to it. Quite attractive little tree. And then the final one that we carry is called Chico, which is the newest one. And it's another variety from Chico State, and it's unique in that it's shaped like an apple. So it's one of the only one we know besides honey jar that's probably wider than it is long. So we don't carry Lang. We'll have all these, or we should have all these available in January. And if you really want to get a nice specimen, we do take bare root orders starting in October for the trees arriving in January. And most of these that we get will be, the trunks will be thicker than this. So 3/8 inch thick and to a half inch thick, which would be pencil to say pinky thickness on the trunk. So they'll come in nicer than these. These, when we sold out of all the nicer ones during bare root season, I asked them to send us anything they had left. And a lot of them were considered, well, this is the main trunk on this one. This is like 1/4 inch caliper or even 3/16 inch caliper. So that's about as small as they sell, but you can see the tree is growing nicely. So some of them do turn out pretty nice. Okay, that's jujubes. Now we're kind of having the same problem with persimmon trees in that we don't have a lot of them left to sell. We do have, in fact, this group here is pretty much most of the nice ones we have. The problem we're having with both jujubes and persimmons is that 10 years ago we had 3 bare root tree suppliers in California. One by one they've gone, they've quit doing business. One for family matters, another for drought and economy. So we're left with one grower left, which is just not enough to get us the size of persimmon trees we like. I mean, we used to get them in, they were inch caliper, which is trunks pretty darn thick. We're getting plants in that would produce the first year. Now we're lucky to get 1/2 inch caliper. This is pencil thick here, 3/8 inch caliper, which really is all you need to get started, but it's nice to have the bigger ones. So now persimmons do like real well drained soil. So even though most fruit trees will get by in clay soil, even if it doesn't drain well, as long as it's not underwater too long. Persimmons trees, clay soil, make sure it's not the lowest spot in your yard. So you can make a little hill, maybe put sand in the hill, and then they'll do fine. But I did have one instance in my last house where the lowest spot in the yard stayed boggy all the way until summer after some El Nino storms, and I eventually lost the persimmons in that spot. But in another part of my yard where the drainage was still clay but drained decently, they did quite well. So they are picky. Both of these are picky about compost around the root system, so make sure. Now we grow them in our top potting soil, which has no compost in it. So we have no problem growing these. We can water these and keep them really wet. But when we used to use a compost-based soil back in the 80s and early 90s, if we watered them, kept them too wet, the leaves would turn yellow, orange, and red and start dropping off, and the trees would go to sleep real early. So we don't do that anymore. We learned our lesson 30 years ago to use the right soil on these, and now you can keep them as wet as you want, and there's no issues there. So persimmons aren't that hard to grow as long as you use the right soil and don't use compost amendments in the ground. Okay, so persimmons, now jujubes always fruit the first year. Persimmons fruit on second year wood, and they usually take a few years to get going. Sometimes we'll get one or two fruit the first year. They do not need pollinators at all. Well, that's not true. There's one variety here that does. So we'll talk about that too. The most common persimmon that people like are the non-astringent persimmons, and most of those tend to be flat-fruited. So now persimmons are found in North America, on the eastern half of North America. Most of the ones that we like are from China, Japan. There are relatives of this in Central America also. So there are close relatives. The trees called ebony that make the real black wood are down in the tropics, Central and South America, and they are in the same family of persimmon, which is Diospyros. And there is a chocolate persimmon that's found in Mexico that's close related to these, that has similar looking fruit, but it's green instead of orange when it ripens. So anyway, persimmons, there's non-astringent, and astringent. About most of the ones we sell are non-astringent, and all that means is the fruit, even when it's firm and not quite ripe, you can eat it. It tastes fine. The astringent ones have a real unique property to them. I don't know if you've ever drank a astringent wine, but your mouth is the opposite of slimy. So it feels totally dry. You have this, the persimmons can be almost jelly ripe and soft and juicy, but when you put in your mouth feels like it's totally dried up and you can't even talk. So that's an astringency that disappears when the fruit is totally ripe, but not until then. So some of the persimmons we sell are astringent types. Most of the ones that people like are non-astringent, so you can eat them at any time. Even when they're green, you can kind of eat them. I mean, and it's interesting, in Japan, persimmons are in a lot of folklore where animals, they use animals instead of people in these folklore tales. But they'll talk about monkeys that can't stop eating persimmons until their body explodes. They just can't stop. So in Japan, and myself included, they are, very highly esteemed fruit, sweet, slightly firm, slightly crispy on the non-astringent types, kind of a cinnamon, pumpkinish flavor, very fall-like in flavor. Now, if you do have an astringent persimmon, hachia, the ones at the supermarket that look like this, are generally the ones that are astringent. They got little leaf remnant there, or petal remnant on top. Usually, most of the persimmons we sell are seedless. When the cells totally break down and they become jelly-like inside, the astringency goes away. Now, in Japan, they found different ways to do this. One way was to throw them in a empty sake keg, and the ethanol gases would ripen the flesh, or I guess would burst all the cells in the flesh overnight, and the next day they'd be edible. So that's one way to ripen a persimmon. a late friend of mine said, well, you don't need the sake keg. You just get a Ziploc bag, put a few drops of vodka on the end of it, close the bag up, and overnight it would lose its astringency. The other way is in the deep south, the American persimmons are definitely astringent, and the rule there is wait till after the second frost. So you can put these in the freezer and let them thaw once, and then put them back in the freezer and let them thaw again, and then at that point they're totally ripe, and the astringency is gone. So non-astringent ones, you just pick them and eat them. So persimmons, when they're young, they tend to abort a lot of their fruit. So now here's a persimmon, a real small persimmon from last year. It was really skinny. Now we don't like to sell persimmons until the leaves get a good size. Because a lot of times, like say this one for instance, when the leaves first come out, they're only about an inch or two long. They can do that without roots. They don't need roots to get small leaves on them. But once you get leaves that are big, like that or like this, we know they have functional roots, feeder roots, and then we're very comfortable selling those. This one may have roots also. The leaves aren't that big yet, but once they get big, we'll be more comfortable selling it. So this one from last year has decent sized leaves. Now on a mature tree, they'll be slightly larger than this, even 50% larger than these leaves. But you can see this one, it's only on its second year, has got these female flowers. They're making fruit. Now, most persimmons have produced fruit parthenocarpically. That means they don't need to be pollinated. There's no seeds in these. They just make fruit without being pollinated, and that's what this one's doing. Now I see a place up here where the flowers just aborted, they fell off, but these are maintaining, and they'll probably fruit. There's some big leaves next to them. Now we do know on persimmons and jujubes also, fruiting when they're young has a lot, and even when they're older, has a lot to do with the sunlight in the spring.
I have a persimmon tree. It's a blue,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about fifth year in the ground. It just gives a couple, not very much. But this year, it just exploded with blossoms on it like that. So we were gone for a week and a half, and I came back. The majority of them on the ground.
Right. So over the years, we've been watching for our persimmon trees at our house, and if the spring is cloudy, they abort a lot of fruit. They don't have enough energy to finish it off. So that's the problem we see, is if the spring is cloudy, you don't get the best crop in the world. It's better to have some sunlight. I mean, this year rivals one of the cloudiest springs we've ever seen and one of the coolest springs we've ever seen. I mean, basically, our spring this year, the whole year is 5 degrees below normal.
It was amazing how many.
Yeah. Yeah, they can go to town. I mean, back in the 80s when I first started growing persimmons, I had a tree about this big that made 2 fruit on its second year. And by the third year, it wasn't much bigger than this. It had 25. And then the third year, or the fourth year, it still hadn't grown much. It had 75 on a tree that was only this tall and maybe this wide. It was just crazy productive. I had a persimmon next to it that was growing like a weed, didn't make any fruit for 4 years, and then it made 150 on its first crop.
Up near my house is the remains of what used to be a farm. Steve Young was and he sells persimmons. I think it's on 8 or 9 acres. You go back in here and you look at his persimmon trees, sometimes they're just laden with persimmons and playing that.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, persimmons do tend to overproduce. So watch either support the branches. I mean, my little tree that was making 75, I put a stake right next to it and tied all the branches at a place at the top where I can tie all these strings, and I tied all the branches up to the top of the stake. to hold the branches, they wouldn't break. But yeah, they really are good producers.
Do they have to
So
be fed?
not much. Fruit production does not require much fertilizer. I mean, generally with these trees, we do recommend just a general fruit tree fertilizer, but I don't recall fertilizing my persimmons much at all. At either house I've lived at, I've not really fertilized them much, and they produce really well. So dead leaves on the ground tend to be just fine. So anyway, yeah, this one, this is a fuyu type persimmon also, so it'll be a flatter one. Um, Now, persimmons are the most expensive bare roots we get, and that's because they're really brittle trees. When they pull them out of the ground, I think they lose a lot of them. Just the growers, when they get the bare root trees out of the ground, they actually plow them out of the ground, and they are very brittle, especially at the graft union. So they lose a lot of trees apparently, because of the brittleness. And even when we get them, sometimes we don't notice it right away, but the graft is almost detached. So we do lose a lot of persimmons even after we get them because the graft union isn't that good. The other thing about persimmons is that they tend to wake up first year from bare root. They do tend to wake up late. And once they're established, they wake up quicker. But we don't give up on persimmons till mid-August. So the latest we've ever seen a persimmon tree go from a dormant stick like this to a full healthy tree is August. We actually had several that, like this one still looks like it's dead, but the stem's not shriveling. And I have a feeling that this will be awake sometime this summer. Who knows, it might be longer even this year because it's still very early spring-like weather that we're in. So this may stay dormant longer, but it doesn't look like it's dead yet. I have a few out there where the stem is actually turning to a prune, so we know those are goners, but we're waiting on about a half dozen trees to see if they will wake up. Now, some varieties of persimmons are really delicate even after the first year. We've seen certain persimmons even die on us by not waking up. They had leaves on the first year. They never woke up the second, especially if the leaves stay small. Sometimes, some of our trees will make just 10 leaves, and we're saying, okay, that one may not wake up next spring. I don't think it has roots. And we have, like from last year, I think we have two that didn't wake up. We got them in with real thin stems, like this size, and there's no sign of life on those. So persimmons are high priced for several reasons. Okay, we'll go over the varieties now. The most common type is called fuyu, but the original fuyu is not really grown at all anymore. So back in the 50s when I was a kid, I remember eating fuyu persimmons. They weren't as flat as the ones we have now. So the original fuyu persimmons were slightly rounded, not huge. Of course, they still have the flower remnant in the stem. And they usually had, I would say, 3 seeds in them about that size. They're easy to spit out and everything, but they usually had a few seeds. So this one, we haven't grown this thing for at least 30 years at least. It hasn't been around. So that was the original fuyu persimmon. The ones we have now I don't know how they're related to it. I haven't looked up the genetics of these, but the most common one now that's called a fuyu is the genetically different tree called a jiro. And these definitely are bigger fruits. They tend to be flatter, still have that flower remnant No seeds. Not seeing any seeds in Juro. Not seeing any male flowers on Juro either. Just female flowers that set fruit by themselves. So that's, and then these ripen generally October. Now, there's a sport of Juro called Emoto that was found in California. And according to the description, it might even be a little flatter and slightly lobed. So if you see this from the top, the fruit looks like it has 4 sections on it, kind of. Something like that. I'm looking from the top. Very slight, but definitely more lobed than, say, a Juro is. Now, when I was 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that'd be 40 years ago, we were growing both of these. And my dad and I did a taste test, blind taste test on these. And we always liked Emoto better because we felt the texture was better and it was sweeter than the Juro. Well, it turns out Emoto is just a sport of Juro. It's genetically identical to Juro, but it ripens 2 weeks earlier. So we were, whenever you do a taste test at the same time, the Emoto is going to taste a little riper. We also noticed, though, that Emoto tends to be slightly more precocious, which is true for most sports. They are, any plant derived from the original usually matures a little faster than the original. So Emoto, certainly we like that one too. I don't have many Emotos this year. This is Emoto Fuyu here. Leaves are starting to get larger, so we have good hope for this one. We'll probably sell this one also. So Emoto ripens usually late September into October, and the Juro is actually October into November, so they're a few weeks apart. Now there's a third Fuyu type that we carry. It's actually a big family, so there's quite a few different Fuyu type persimmons out there. But another one we do is called Izu, which is a somewhat smaller, slightly more rounded fruit. And that's what this one is that we're waiting to wake up as an Izu. The thing about Izu is it really ripens early in August. So if you really like Fuyu persimmons, and I do, you can have all 3 of these, and the harvest won't overlap too much. Izu in August, Emoto, it's August, September actually. And Emoto, September, October, Juro, October, November. Izu is a smaller tree, and it is definitely a weaker tree than the other 2. So we've had a number of customers tell us that their Izus from Beirut this year didn't wake up, so not a great crop of Izus this year. The first time I grew Izu, the fruit started turning orange in July. I'm going, oh my God, this is early. Now, the book says Izu tastes better than the other Fuyus, but there's just no way you can compare them. It ripens so early, there's no way that it would be a fair test to compare them unless you put them in, your refrigerator for a long time. So that's the most popular is, again, the Fuyu type persimmons. Now the other persimmons, Hachia is the main astringent one that is sold a lot at the supermarkets. Hachia is, let's see. So Hachia has got an interesting history. It was introduced to the U.S. back in the 30s And a lot of farmers thought, boy, this is going to be, they taste it and go, this is really a really sweet, big fruit, heavy producer. So they said in the 1940s and 50s, there were 4,000 acres of hot chias planted in California. They thought it was going to be the next big thing, but there was no one that wanted to eat them. So most of those orchards were taken out. Now hot chia, again, it's very astringent till it's ripe. But there's one thing you can do with hot chias that's unique is that they dry really, really well. And when they dry these things, it's like it's fruit heaven. I mean, I don't recall, boy, I have to look it up again. In Japan, Japanese for persimmon is kaki. I believe the dried fruit name is hoshigaki. I should have looked it up before class. But there are farms that will dry these fruit, and online when you buy them, it's like $20 a pound nowadays, because it is really one of the tastiest. Now they do a lot of work with them. They'll actually take the fruit off, skin it. Actually, what they do is they leave it attached to the stem it's on, cut off a piece of stem. They'll peel it with one of those potato peelers, take all the skin off, and tie it to a string and hang it up on the side of a barn, or just hang them underneath the roof of a house. And as this dries, the sugar comes to the surface, and once a week they will squeeze and manipulate, massage the fruit to keep it from hardening up and get more of the juice out of it. And after a few months of that hanging up there, it's just perfection. And around Christmas time, we'd buy the dried hot chia persimmons. Christmas time, New Year's, very much a treat. If you find them at a Asian market, that's one of the best things you'll ever eat. So, and hot chia's heavy producers. I mean, they just make a ton of fruit. One of our friends brings us at least 3 shopping bags full of hot chia persimmons off one tree every year, and that's maybe 1/10 of what she harvests off the tree. Now, the other unusual persimmons that we carry, one's called chocolate. Now, chocolate's unusual. It's shaped about like so. It has seeds. This is a chocolate persimmon. My last one I have, I think. And what you're looking at on this tree are all male flowers. I don't see a single female on here right now. It's all male flowers. They'll make about 20 male flowers for every female flower on the tree. So they pollinate themselves. They can also pollinate other persimmons. But when they have the seeds in them, the flesh comes out with a lot of brown specks in it, and it does give it somewhat of a slightly chocolatey flavor. Quite good sized fruit. So that's the chocolate persimmon. Then there's another persimmon called coffee cake, which is a little bit more this shape. But coffee cake requires the chocolate or male flowers to pollinate it. And we tell people, do not buy a coffee cake persimmon unless you already have the chocolate, or you buy the chocolate with it. Because we've grown coffee cake thinking that the other persimmons in my yard, the fuyu, I had 2 kinds of fuyu, would make some male flowers to pollinate this thing, and they never did. So if this makes fruit without pollination, it's full size. It's kind of a blah orange color, not a real pretty, brilliant color like most persimmons, kind of a dull orange color. But without seeds in it, it never ripens. It's just like stays real firm, kind of like a quince flesh, where you just can't eat it. It's like leather. When it's got seeds, it's really good, but if it doesn't have seeds in it, it's basically inedible. I've tried to ripen them because my tree would make hundreds of fruit, but none of them are edible. So that's the thing with coffee cake. Now there's one other persimmon that we sell in the winter. It's called Joe. Small fruit, astringent till ripe. It is considered the sweetest of all persimmons. It's really sweet. I mean, it's very sugary, but you do have to wait till it's astringent, till it's totally ripe. We're sold out of those. That's the only one we're totally out of today. Um, and all these, again, if you want nice specimens of them, at least as nice as this one here, then buy the bare roots, order the bare roots in October, November, because we're only allotted so many nice trees. Uh, our supplier can only do about 20 nice ones of each one because of the demand for persimmons nowadays too. Persimmons haven't seen many pests. If anything, if there's a lot of ants on it, watch out for scale. Um, they can all grow fairly large, you know, in 40, 50 years they can be 40, 50 foot, but it does take them a long time to get size. They're not speed burners, so they'll grow gradually, and you can keep them in a small size pretty easily. And they do bear on last year's growth, so don't cut them too severely when you're cutting them. Um, any questions? Okay. All right. Thank you.